Welcome everybody to our webinar on ingredient supply and change of sources for medicine manufacturer. The RACI Farm Group actually ran its first webinar back in April and on supply issues caused by COVID-19. I think back then a lot of us actually thought that by the end of 2020 we'd probably be back to normal, which is of course not even close to being the case. So we thought we'd take the opportunity to look at supply chain and things like that, a bit more of a deep dive really, and see what's been happening in Australia and the what's going to happen in the future as well as we go forward. So just quickly, what we'll do is I'll go through the format of the webinar for you and then talk about our presenters and then let them get on and do their presentations. So firstly, we are using Zoom, obviously. What we'd like is we'd like a good Q&A at the end. So please, whilst our speakers are presenting, feel free to ask a question, get it in the Q&A window. Please use that function. We're not going to have the raise hand function available because it's just difficult to manage it, but please do use the Q&A function. So if you're unfamiliar with Zoom, the Q&A function is kind of down the bottom of the window. You can see the little Q&A logo down the bottom, and then you can just ask your question and they'll be asked either in writing or by one of the panelists. Also is where you can put those through anonymously, and once questions are answered, everybody can view those. So with that done, moving on to today's speakers. So we've got 3 talks today. Firstly, we've got the TGA, Dr. Felicity Jameson and Dr. Karen Loft, talking about, the TGA's experience with prescription medicines during COVID-19 and those market supply issues, variations. We've then got Merck giving us kind of 6 months on lesson learned. Rebecca and Scott will be talking on that. Rebecca was actually in that first webinar that I just mentioned, talking about it right from the outset. So that'll be a good little catch up. And David Edmonds will be talking about medicines manufacturer perspective. So really from that manufacturer's perspective and give you that oversight. So I will now pass over to Felicity and Karen from the TGA. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Felicity Jameson, and this is Karen Loft. We're from the Pharmaceutical Chemistry Variations section of the TGA, and our talk this afternoon is on ARTG variations that support market supply. I'd like to reflect a little bit on the year we've had so far with the global pandemic. So the structure of my presentation, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our team and where we sit within the TGA, which is quite a big organisation. We'll then go through a little bit about how our register is varied. So the ARTG stands for the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. We'll talk you a little bit through some of the data that we see to support these variations and what we evaluate, and then some alternative pathways. So other ways that the market can get supply other than varying a registered good. And finally, just some reflections on the year to date and some of the challenges that we've faced. So here's a very high level view of the TGA and its divisions. So you've got the big organisation called the TGA with 3 divisions: the regulatory practice and support, medical devices and product quality, and medicines regulation. And we're within medicines regulation. Within medicines regulation, there are 4 branches, and you can see the 4 branches here. Our branch is called scientific evaluation, and it primarily focuses on prescription medicines. Within the scientific evaluation branch, we have a number of different sections. You can see we've got biological sciences, toxicology, and pharmaceutical chemistry is now split into 2 sections, the registration section and the variation section. So the registration section will do the pharmaceutical chemistry evaluation for new register entries and major variations, whereas my team look at all of the essentially the minor variations of goods once they're on the register. We have a scientific operations and management section, and we also participate in regulatory strengthening program, which involves other countries throughout the region. So the difference, I've also got a note here about some of the differences between pharmaceutical chemistry and our colleagues in biological sciences. Essentially, if the active is a small molecule, we'll look at it. If it's a biologically derived active, then biological sciences will look at it. So they will do all of the biosimilar evaluations, for example. So just to touch on this very briefly, registered medicines come under a framework where therapeutic goods must be entered into the register before they're supplied in Australia. And these goods will have an OSTAR number on the label. And so all of our prescription medicines, we're talking about registered medicines, and they should always have an OSTAR on the label. As always, there's more information available on our website, which I encourage you to go and have a look if this is of interest to you. Now, I'm going to quickly hand over to Karen to talk a little bit more about variations in particular.
So, good afternoon, everybody. As Felicity mentioned, once the product is entered into the ARTG, it's expected that the product is kept up to date. And by up to date, I mean it's kept up to date with the known information about that particular product. So that known information might be in relation to some additional clinical information in relation to the indications or extensions of indications to the product. It might also involve some new dosage forms or new strengths or new formulations. It might also include what we refer to as the minor variations, which are smaller changes, hence the term minor. And the key difference between these two, the major variations and the minor variations, is essentially that the major variations are supported by some sort of clinical information that needs to be evaluated, whereas the minor variations typically don't require any major clinical information to be submitted. So in terms of the minor variations, that's what we in PCVS look at. This is just a list of a snapshot, I guess, of some of the main types of changes that you might see or might need to vary your medicine for. These can be related to any one or any number of these. So for example, you can change the quality information in relation to the excipients or the specifications or the tests that you use to control the quality of the excipients or the drug product itself. It might involve very small and minor changes to the formulation. So you might have to change a supplier for your coating materials. So if it's just a colour that you need to change, or make a very minor adjustment to the grade of an excipient that you need to use in your formulation, then that typically or could fall in as a minor variation, provided that there's no clinical data required to support that. It could also relate to, as you can see, there are various other things here, but I guess for the context of this discussion, it can involve and often involves changes to the API or the drug product manufacturer or the route of manufacturing or both of those. So in terms of changes to the API manufacturer, as was briefly disclosed on one of the previous slides, the minor variations are broken up into various levels. So the notifications or self-assessable requests or category 3 type changes, and these broadly relate to the risk associated with that particular change. So as an example, for the active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturer, you can add or change the site of the starting material supplier or an intermediate of the API starting material. And provided that there's no changes to the route of manufacture or the reagents or any solvents that you might use, then that's considered a fairly low risk change. If there's no changes to the manufacturing process, then there should be no changes to the quality profile of the API itself. Similarly, if you're changing the site that performs the API manufacture and there's no changes to the route of synthesis, the reagents, the solvents, the in-process controls, if they're all exactly the same as what we currently have approved, then again, there should be a fairly low risk of changes to the quality profile, so the impurities, for example, and there should be also no changes to things that might affect drug product performance, things like polymorphism or particle size that might affect the dissolution rate, for example, for some solid oral dosage forms. And both of those are in the low risk category. They can be done as notifications. However, if you can't meet any one of the conditions that we have outlined in our guidance document, then that risk or the potential for the risk then increases, and then that change is no longer considered a low risk change. And it's what we call a category 3 change, where you need to submit the data set to us for evaluation. So the notifications are almost immediately approved on the basis that if you've met all those conditions and it's a low risk, there should be no changes, and that goes through without the review of any quality data. However, that doesn't mean that you can't, or that does mean that you still have to generate batch data and any other related data that need to be performed in order to validate that change. And as you can see down the bottom, we've had this year so far many more category 3 applications come in for these type of changes than we have notifications. So that means that lots of changes have come through to change the synthetic route or site that can't meet the notifiable conditions. Similarly, for the same sorts of approach is taken for the finished product manufacturer. If it's a non-sterile product and that there are no changes to the manufacturing process or any of the in-process controls, then these changes to sites of manufacture can be submitted as a notification. However, again, if you can't meet all of the conditions or there are differences between the routes of manufacture, then these changes have to be submitted as a category 3 change for the TGA to assess. So as I've tried to indicate, notifications must not include any changes to the quality of the product. Need to meet a strict set of conditions that we have outlined in our guidance. Batch data, of course, and any other relevant information, such as comparative dissolution data, need to be generated in order to support the changes. For category 3 evaluations, as an example, the types of information that we will need to see are GMP clearances for any new sites, particularly drug substance manufacturing sites and drug product or quality control sites for the drug product. We need to see any differences as a result of the change in relation to process manufacturing or batch size, all those that sorts of detail. Of course, we need to see process validation information and data that demonstrate that test methods, if transferred, have been done so appropriately. And of course, certificates of analysis and supporting data such as dissolution testing to demonstrate that the quality of the product is unchanged and the performance of the product will remain the same. And stability data if needed. So, as I mentioned earlier, notifications are not assessed and are approved generally within 48 hours of submission. Self-assessable requests or category 3 requests have a 45 working day timeframe, which is from start 45 days from start to finish, and that excludes any requests for information. One important thing to note is that the TGA requires both the electronic data, so the supporting data, in addition to the fees before the application is made effective, and then therefore before the evaluation areas see the data. So that requires the sponsors to consider both the manufacturing sites and any shipping timeframes in order to coordinate the supply of stock that might be being manufactured here in Australia or getting shipped from overseas, to ensure that regulatory approval is done in a timely manner and to ensure that market supply is continued. So normally this is something that seems to be managed fairly well, but of course things happen, COVID happens, and sometimes issues come up that prevents these applications being able to be made on time, or the manufacturing sites being able to wait for the regulatory process to occur, which then brings Felicity onto the next part of the discussion.
That's right. So I will talk a bit about the impact of this timing consideration on our variation requests, but first I just wanted to touch on the fact that there are alternatives to what we're describing, which have been used throughout this year as a means to get continuous supply on the Australian market. So in addition to variation requests, we have that time implication and then a 45-day working day timeframe for us. We have seen market supply met through these other avenues. Section 14 consent may be used, for example, to supply goods that are labelled in labels other than the approved Australian labels, which therefore don't meet TGA 91. Special access scheme and section 19A are both pathways that our special access branch administer, and they're both utilised under, again, strict sort of criteria, but when you might want to bring in what's technically an unapproved or not the product that's on the ARTG medicine when there's a supply issue. But yeah, going back, I guess this is our final slide, but it's got quite a bit in here. Really, what we've seen this year is it's been, I think, harder for our sponsors to make a timely application for their variation in light of the pandemic. So what this has meant is we've seen a 3.5-fold increase in the number of people that come to us and say, could you prioritise the evaluation of my variation request? And they're citing COVID-19 as a reason. We've accommodated these requests because we understand that our local sponsors were really put under a lot of strain, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the market. So we were looking at prioritising medicines, for example, that are used in intensive care units. And of course, there's now been some treatments come through onto the register. But really, these requests to prioritise could essentially be for any prescription medicine, because the market uncertainty just meant supply chains across the world were disrupted. Of course, our market is very small in a global sense, so local sponsors had to make a case to get a certain, X amount of stock to Australia. So there's a lot of, we could see this sort of competition play out. So what we're really trying to do is harmonise globally and make sure that we were mindful of, I guess, these constraints on sponsors while maintaining our regulatory oversight. And we don't tend to see a lot of local manufacturing sites in Australia for prescription medicines. And so this is probably where people we're needing to put alternative manufacturing sites onto the register. We're still reviewing the data that we've got, but it does look like we can point to an increase in the number of finished product manufacturers being added to the register this year. And I just wanted to stop and point out that it's been a big year all around, and it probably would have been without COVID. This is the year that our big international harmonisation of ingredients name project finished. TGO 69, which was the labelling order, sunsetted, and now TGO 91 is the only labelling order. So we had big long transition periods end this year where people had to, sponsors had to ensure that they had fully transitioned all of their products over. And that's some 15,000 prescription medicines. So it's no small feat to get all those changes through in time. The product information documents have undergone a reformat, and this has been a big year for that as well. There's been opioid reforms where we've asked sponsors to register with smaller pack sizes. And of course, globally, we're dealing with things like nitrosamines, where for a number of products, we've had to work with sponsors to introduce new tests and limits to control nitrosamine contamination. And again, Karen can attest to this with lots of late night teleconferences. We've been working with our counterparts internationally to make sure that our response is in step with the other major jurisdictions. So that's it from us for the moment. It's been a big year with a lot of challenges, and I'm sure we're all looking for a bit of a break over the Christmas period. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was wonderful.
Great, thanks Scott, and hello everybody. It's nice to be back here with you. I guess we didn't expect to be still in the situation, I guess, eight months ago when we first had our first RACI webinar on this topic. But it's nice to be back here again. My name is Rebecca Lee. I'm the Managing Director of Merck Life Science here in Australia and New Zealand. And for those who weren't attending the previous webinar in April, I actually joined Merck in March this year, so it's certainly been a very interesting year, and I'll leave it for another time to talk about the journey of trying to meet people in a virtual space. But it's great to be back here again with you. I've brought along with me today Scott Maybe, who's our Head of Supply Chain. Scott, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. So I've been with the organization now for coming up 8 years, so typically working in a global supply chain capacity. So it's really exciting for me. I took up a position here a little over 12 months ago, and it's certainly been an interesting 12 months in Australia, I can say that much. Thank you.
Terrific. So today we'll look back over those last 8-9 months that we've had since it all happened. And the purpose of having Scott today is to really share what we've been doing from a supply chain point of view, because obviously we all know Australia is a long way away from everywhere. And I think we all felt it particularly this year. And as the TGA was talking about, we've all been very much challenged by supply chains and had to do a lot of flipping around and being really agile to cope with it. So let's get in, and we're happy to share those some of those learnings and insights with you. Moving ahead, Scott, thanks. So I guess I just wanted to call it out that it has been a very VUCA year this year. So for those who don't know that acronym, it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think that just sums it up. We've really had no playbook for this. This is something that we haven't seen in pretty much all of our lifetimes. While there's been some smaller outbreaks across, in terms of viruses, nothing to the same scale that has been for this year. So we were all trying to feel our way through it and try to make the most of what the opportunities that were there, as well as dealing with the uncertainty that was in front of us. Particularly in the initial couple of months, I think certainly going back to March, we had some huge increases in demand, or volatility. So some was up and some were certainly down. We had increased demand in the pharma manufacturing area. A lot of biotech companies really pivoted to change what they were doing. Obviously, we'll focus on anything to do with COVID, vaccines and therapeutics. Diagnostics, we saw the emergence of new manufacturers in the diagnostic space as people were trying desperately to get kits into the country, but also looking to develop these homegrown kits. And then Merck is a supplier into the research sector in the university market. And we saw a lot of universities had to close down, particularly from the start of the year, because of international students not being around. And so as labs not having the bodies in the lab to be able to do the work, or even closing labs down because it was decided unessential. There was a clear requirement for new products, as you heard from the TGA, new products, new materials, new manufacturing. But we had very much high demand, and I guess that's peaks and troughs of the manufacturing sectors going through. And particularly, it then caused a little bit of disruption then, because we hadn't seen or predicted anything that could happen from a global point of view in our supply chains. And I'll leave Scott to go through this in a little bit more detail, but you can see there, we certainly felt that Australia and New Zealand, given our location, was one of the hardest regions that were hit by this, because of our reliance very much so on air cargo, sea cargo, for pretty much all of the raw materials that we need. Next slide, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Rebecca. So as you can see here, globally, air cargo freight was down 18% and still remains down to this day compared to the previous year. What we can also see is that the international passenger flights coming into both Australia and New Zealand are again significantly down, if at all. And as a result of that, what we've actually experienced is a real increase this year, as you can see, in the number of aircraft being stored and grounded through this period, which is really then piling that pressure back on that air cargo, which is already down compared to last year. What we can also see is sea freight as a whole. We're seeing some longer transit times and longer delays due to port congestion, both in terms of in Europe, in the US, and also once it reaches here, because we have that higher demand that's not being fulfilled with the air freight element, which is really continued to impact us. Naturally, when we're switching things from air to sea as well, we're experiencing that the downside of the longer lead times, which takes us slightly longer to be able to bring the key products into the country. Thank you, Scott.
Next slide, thanks. So what did we do, and how did we respond to such an unprecedented time? I think as a company, we take our responsibility as an organisation really seriously. For those who don't know Merck, we've been around for 352 years. It's a family-owned business. Only 30% of our business is listed on the German Stock Exchange. So we really, truly had, I think, very strong family values. And those were about care. It was really care for our staff. It was care for our customers, and also care for our community. And really, those were the priorities that we put in place. So it was around, how do we keep our staff engaged and motivated when everyone is having to work from home? We have a business, we have a responsibility to continue to supply. So how do we get that, how do we make that ability for our people to be able to continue to work effectively and to continue to engage? It was also around the responsibility that we have to continue our supply. As you're aware, some of the materials that we supply into the market in Australia are absolutely critical, whether that's solvents going into making hand sanitizer, or ingredients or consumables going in for vaccine research, or at least even diagnosis and evaluation of point of care testing. So we definitely took on that responsibility, that we have a need to continue to be able to ensure our business can continue, because we are then able to supply our market. So next slide, thanks. So what did we do? We really took an approach of safety first. So obviously as an organisation, and I think what we really heavily spent a lot of time talking about back in April was around, how do we put COVID safe plans in place? Now we have a term for it, COVID safe plan. So it was really around, how do we make sure our operations, how do we make sure our people working at home are safe? Because we're all in that position at the time. And it was very much around giving people checklists to be able to work from home, get their setups right, so that they were in a good frame of mind. I think certainly during the lockdown periods, it was more challenging, particularly for folks in Melbourne, like Scott and I are, when we had those quite severe lockdowns. How do you keep people motivated as well as keep them engaged? So a lot of things around trying to make sure that people had, or our our staff in particular, had some ways to connect. So whether that was through drink sessions or communication sessions to keep it going. But more importantly, and I guess from a business continuity point of view, it's really around, and I guess good timing today with the TGA, it's really around that regulatory management and trade compliance. In particular, in times like this, where there's a lot of demand for products that are new, having the ability to have a good response from our regulatory partners in Australia is absolutely vital to ensuring that we were able to secure those materials. We had some huge demand spikes of products that we've never seen before here. And so working closely with partners like TGA, like the DAWE, to make sure that the materials we were able to get permits, and we certainly see a lot of collaboration that was needed, but a lot of agility as well. Obviously, as a business, for us, it was really making sure that we had the good scenario planning, because back in that March, April time, we didn't know what the future was going to be looking like. Whether it was that Q4 would be back to normal and we'd all be open and moving around freely, we didn't know. And so obviously when you're looking forward as a business to say, what do we need to do and how do we need to react, we had to put in some different scenarios. So we took some advice from the McKinseys of the world and looked very much at 3 different scenarios. And that was, one was what we call a V-shaped recovery. So that was pretty much a sharp bounce back that we would then have a business opened, able to get around again and be able to get back on track in terms of business. The other was very much a U-shaped recovery. So that picture of the U with a much more slower and I guess extended duration of the bottom of the curve, and then a slower return back to normal. And the third one that we looked at, which was called a periodic recurrence. And that is that we would have lockdown, go back into lockdown, be released, go back into lockdown. And so having the ability to go through and look at each of those scenarios, to look at what impact would that have on our business, what impact would that have on our forecasting, and requirements that we needed to do, really made it, I guess, at this point in time when we're in such a volatile and uncertain world, give us those steps that we could put in place to make sure that we had the continuity of business. Looking back, do we have a V, U, or periodic recurrence? Well, touch wood, I think we're in a bit of a U-shaped recovery at the moment. So far, the industry in Australia is being able to return to some semblance of normal, and we hope that it continues along this line. And I'll hand over to Scott to talk about the other parts of what we did.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the key things that's been touched on is that volatility, and what we really saw in the month of March was that real sharp increase in demand on products that we typically sold well, and also products that we never really previously sold. So one of the things that we had to work very quickly on as an organization here locally was to put in place a product allocation process. And in order to do that, what we had to do was really get our hands on data very, very quickly and develop very robust processes using new data tools that were developed specifically to enable the product allocation processes, so we could ensure that we put our focus and our efforts on those critical COVID products, really where the critical applications were for them. And that really enabled us to better service our customers from that perspective, and also try and fair share, because we have a number of key customers, obviously, that need to be serviced with our products. So that was absolutely vital for us to put that into play. And then with global transportation, so the TGA touched on this with the late night calls. So I can certainly testify there was a number of very early morning calls with the US and late night calls with Europe to really work with our transportation teams to really understand what was happening in those countries and what was happening in terms of the supply lines. So some of the opportunities that we were really searching for at that time is where we had the possibility to either source from potentially Europe or the US, and making the necessary switches so that we could better guarantee that continuity of supply. And that's something that we really played with throughout this COVID period, from pretty much March onwards, to try and have more robust and reliable supply lines. We faced a number of challenges as well due to distance. And here in Australia, we're fairly remote. So being able to identify where lanes are getting congested through different countries in Asia, etc., and look at exploiting opportunities, working with our global transportation teams to utilize different lanes that were showing, you know, less congestion, and trying to be ahead of the curve there so that we could really try and bring our products into the country is, let's say, with the minimal impact that we possibly could, given the scenarios we were facing. And it was really about having that continued dialogue. And it was essentially a daily dialogue to really work with all of our intercompany and external partners and the transportation team to really look at the opportunities as they presented themselves, and also communicating proactively where we did have challenges, because, you know, the backlogs in airports or at the ports, and we're really trying to be on the front foot in communicating that outwards to really set the expectations. From a manufacturing perspective, as we've touched on, we've seen this volatility. We've seen basically unprecedented demand on normally stocked items and also non-stocked items that we typically would not have the demand for. So really having our manufacturing sites adapting to these and also shifting their focus to really narrow in on those sort of key COVID critical products was of paramount importance to really try and minimize the negative impact that was potentially there. Next slide.
Yeah. So I wanted to focus a little bit here on what did we learn, and what will we continue to take away from this experience. And I think the first one is quite obvious. It's about agility. Obviously, the working from home environment created probably a space that we thought we wouldn't be in within 1 year or within 9 months. We very quickly were able to ensure that, you know, and again, across the country and across the globe, organisations were able to continue, have the right technology, be able to facilitate people working in their home environments. Sure, not all of it went well, and I think NBN in Australia was a challenge for some people. But again, it was around finding the opportunities to help people through. We certainly relied quite a lot on those Telstra dongles to support people to work in that virtual world, but also understanding what does a virtual world look like and how do we adapt to that. So some of the things that we did was we started off with and anyone that follows us on social media would know that we had a #SpreadKindness campaign, and it became particularly important when Melbourne went into the hard lockdown. We have the bulk of our staff are located in Melbourne. This is where we have our customer service and our supply chain teams. And it was tough for some people, you know, being at home. For those of you that weren't so familiar with Melbourne, we had a 5 kilometre limitation. We could only travel within 5 kilometres of our home. We had 1 hour of exercise a day, and we also could only go to the shops. Basically, all that was open was the supermarkets. So how do you make people feel positive throughout such a difficult experience? And so we had a #SpreadKindness campaign, which culminated over the school holidays with some at-home science experiments, which we did with all our staff and our particularly our kids that were at home when there was home learning. But it's also around those digital connections and really understanding and seeing what tools are out there to stay connected throughout this time, and how do we use the tools to our advantage. Probably the other thing, and I think is very much as what the TGA was talking about as well, is collaboration. And absolutely, in a time like this, it is key, and we see the importance of how that works. not only between internal and external, but also throughout the organisation. So whether that's our customer sales teams, our sales and marketing organisations, dealing then with our regulatory affairs team, and certainly collaborating with authorities to make sure that there's clear understanding. And as Scott mentioned, communication really is key during those times. And the third one, I'll hand over to Scott.
Yeah, thank you. So data has been key for a long time, and it will continue to be more important as we move forwards because we've got more access to it and quicker access to it. And this was something that was really highlighted in that initial period of working from home, and how could we best leverage the data over, at times, what was a fairly strained NBN network here locally. So one of the things that we looked really at doing it is obviously moving a lot of our stuff to the cloud so that we could be more efficient in terms of the way we access data. And then how can we use that data? Well, looking at our forecasting models and our approaches, a key example of this is how we did the product allocation process that we worked through. And that was able to happen purely because of the data that we had and the tools that we were able to leverage from that to really give us those insights, and also being able to really conduct more, I would say, detailed analysis quicker, and building custom dashboards that can be shared throughout the organization, so that people can really see those insights quicker. So we're not waiting for reports to be generated, but having it at the touch of a button, and really being able to understand then some of the shifts in demand, and then the shifts back sort of from July onwards, we sort of saw that kind of return back to, I would say, more normalized demand. So really being able to make the data available, given the constraints, and also make it more palatable and more digestible.
And next slide, but I think that's it from us. So thanks for the time this afternoon. It's been really great to share with you again some of the learnings that we've had. And yeah, please reach out to us if you have any further questions. We'll be hanging around for the discussion anyway after this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca and Scott. That was wonderful. We do have a quick question come in about, what are your immediate and ongoing plans for managing the growing number of airplanes in Alice Springs? Is that, you don't have any control over that, obviously, but is that part of your strategies, your VU, and I can't remember what the other one was called. I apologize. Yeah,
so I think that's obviously not a specific Merck challenge. That's a challenge for pretty much everyone that imports into the country, and also anyone that wants to come into the country. So look, it's really about understanding how the environment changes. So we know there's a number of vaccines being kind of worked on, and a number which are being approved in different countries. And really it's about, and this is something Rebecca touched on, is being agile and reacting to what we're seeing in the market. As more international flights are returning to Australia, we'll see less flights grounded. And then as a result, that's also more opportunity for products to also make their way into the country. So it's something that we'll certainly be continuing to monitor. I know me personally, I have weekly meetings to look at these topics and understanding how the dynamic is shifting. And then based on that, we look at putting the sort of appropriate strategy in place to best utilize that.
Cool. There was a very quick question on the back of that about the air traffic percentages. So is it down by 18% or?
Yeah, so globally, air cargo is down 18%.
Compared to last year, is that basically?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, excellent. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, but obviously passenger is a little variable at the moment. Early in the pandemic, I think it was 90+% of planes, passenger aircraft grounded. But I think, as Scott said, we're seeing some return, particularly now Australia has some borders reopening. I think there is expectation that we'll start to see increased flights across the country. We're seeing a little bit more of that now. But the international is still challenged, as I was saying.
Has the price markedly changed? Are they fleecing you because there's not many flights to get something on there?
Good question. Yeah, so naturally when the number of available flights decreases, the same is true for when you're taking your holidays abroad as well. The costs go up with less available. So yeah, certainly we're paying more than we did last year to bring the product into the country.
Okay, fair enough. All right, thank you for that. I'll stop the share now and get David to go into his presentation.
Okay, I'll just go to the
just share your screen. Yep.
Share screen facility. And where are we? Wrong one. Sorry.
All right, we can see your screen if you just want to put it onto slideshow mode.
I've got scheduling made easy there on my screen.
We can see your presentation. Just it's slide 1. Just you're not in slideshow mode. That's all.
Okay. Okay, we in slideshow mode now?
Yeah, can you just swap your screens round? So at the top where it says display settings, you can just swap the 2 screens round because we're seeing your presenter notes, that's all.
Nice.
Or share the other screen, 1 or 2. Yeah, there, that's it. Yep, first option would be swap round, yep.
Okay, how's that?
It's just loading up, I think. I can still see the same thing.
What, you can still see the 2?
Yeah, I can still see the presenter mode. Can you click that swap presenter view? Unless it's locked, I can still see that in the drop down at the top.
How's that?
No, it's still the same. Sorry.
Let me try one last one and duplicate slideshow. That better?
It's just a bit slow loading, I think. Yep, perfect, perfect.
Okay.
All right.
Well, we'll go without my notes. I'm David Edmonds. I worked some 40 years in manufacture and quality assurance and regulatory, and the last 20 years or so was involved with an R&D company. I've been away now from employment as such for about the last 12 years and did a little bit of consultancy, and that's why you've got that down the bottom. So I'm away from the coalface, if I can put it that way, but for all that, principles don't change very much, and consequently it's principles that I'll like to share with you. Are we getting that bar up the top there or not?
No, you're fine, David. That's fine. That's only what you see. No dramas.
Okay, well, what's the objective? We'd like to talk about change control with a relevance to specifications and other related issues. So in terms of change control, our objectives are surely to make the change, but to maintain the integrity and the performance, safety and efficacy of the existing product. These are my definitions at this point, rather than formal ones from other things. So again, feel welcome to discuss this subsequently. So change control is covered by regulatory, as we've already heard, and also by the product, by the inspection and the Code of Good Manufacturing Practice. And consequently, cooperation and interaction is required with both regulatory groups. So why do we change? Well, we change, as we've discussed at the moment, because there's a shortage of supply. We might change because it's cheaper to change, and the financial people are always looking to cut costs. And there can be other reasons as well, which are perhaps less relevant to this particular discussion. But again, if people want to discuss that after this presentation, that's fine. What are the consequences? Sorry, I've gone back.
Is it playing up, David, for you?
No, I've got a bar across the top and I can't see my headings.
Oh, okay. You not just hit the right arrow to go to the next one?
Okay. So we've got what's involved, and we've got to take on board is the costs of materials and the costs of introducing, validating and approving the changes. Changes aren't costless, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We've also got the timings. Is it urgent in terms of maintaining essential medicine supply, or can we do it at comparative convenience? Who's involved? Well, purchasing and logistics and inventory and the financial folk are also involved, as well as QA and production and regulatory. So there's got to be a constant communication and collaboration among the various groupings, and of course, documented decisions. Now, the Code of GMP addresses change, and if you do a search on the word change through the code, you'll find it jumps up quite often. There's also a TGA interpretation of the current Code of GMP, which was put out last September, and among its statements is that it's an expectation that change control just does not apply to validation, but to all GMP-related activities undertaken by a manufacturer. In other words, changes go above and beyond material supply or immediate activities.
David, sorry to interrupt. We're still seeing your first slide. We're not moving through the deck. I presume you're moving through the slides.
Oh.
Yeah, that's okay. Let me just share my screen. I've got it here just because it seems to be playing up from your end. So let me just quickly share from this
sorry
end.
about that.
That's quite all right. I should have interjected.
It worked at the rehearsal, folks.
Yeah, it always does. Just give me a second. So what slide were you on, David?
I was on about 5, I think.
This one here, financial consequences. Can you see that on the screen?
Yeah.
Just tell us when you want to flick, when you want me to flick
Okay, well,
through.
we discussed the financial consequences, so flick. Flick again. We discussed the timing, that it might or might not be at comparative convenience. And we discussed that there's many areas within an organisation that are involved. Yep. The Code of GMP has been upgraded by PICS, and the TGA's put an interpretation out, as you can see with that reference. Next. And among things that the TGA has said is that change control not only just applies to validation, but to all GMP activities. Okay, next. And within the code itself, among many relevant clauses about change, it says in 1.4 that you've got a plan for changes. And then after you've done the work, that you've got to confirm that the quality results, objectives rather, were achieved. And you've got to take into account the regulatory notification and approvals as required. So the Code of GMP is quite explicit that regulatory people have to be involved. Okay, next, Scott. I think, did you jump to then? Yeah, can you come back one, please? No, sorry, one forward. It's okay. Validations include significant amendments to the process, including any change in equipment or materials, so that if there are changes in materials which are regarded as significant and that they might affect the quality, then they should be, they've got to be validated. Yep, next. And it also talks about the supply chain for active ingredients, at least, should be available and retained. So you've got to know not only who you're actually getting it from as a distributor, but you've got to go right back to the source. Yeah. So what specifications might we be working with? They might be within the existing specifications, or hopefully in exceptional circumstances, it might require an adjustment of the specifications as well. And in parentheses, we've also got to distinguish between the manufacturing source and the supplier, and they may or may not be the same. So we need to be involved with specifications from the source. Okay, thanks, Scott. So I'll talk a little bit about material specifications, and they're required not only for safety and efficacy, but also for the process and or the product performance. And they're also basic in terms of assessing changes. Specifications really should be numeric as much as possible these days, and consequently, by being numeric, you can get a direct comparison. Yeah, next. So in terms of change control, do existing specs actually cover what parameters, again, might change? And I'm thinking perhaps with this pharmacopoeia, which can often just be purity issues and impurities, they mightn't cover the parameters for your particular product. And this particularly applies to physical attributes, which I'll go into in just a second or so. Okay. So there's a formal definition of specification in ICHQ 6, which is defined as a list of tests, and that a reference to analytical procedures, limits, and again, I point out that they say are numerical limits. Okay. There's also, under control strategy, a larger group called the critical quality attributes. And these are broader than just straight specifications. Next, please, Scott. And they're defined as physical, chemical, biological, or micro properties that should again be within appropriate limits to ensure the desired product quality. Well, what's the difference between these and specs? And hopefully it's on the next slide. Yep. So specs are used for routine batch test requirements, notwithstanding that the other characteristics are expected to be consistent. But the CQAs cover the non-routine characteristics, and these are likely to be developed and learned about as the product is in its early development stages, where these attributes, and particularly physical attributes, can be learned about. Okay, next, Scott. So I'd suggest reading that particular website as to how specifications can be developed. Yep. So in terms of APIs and excipients, the physical properties that might matter to your particular product include the appearance, the solubility, the hygroscopicity, the crystalline products properties in particular, and particles sizes, distributions, density, etc. Okay. And these can have a direct effect on the formulated product in manufacturing steps, preparations of solutions, granulations, yeah, okay. And also in subsequent product performance. And the TGA has already alluded to dissolution profiles being so essential, but it could be to do with emulsion characteristics, suspension characteristics, solubilizations of materials for injection. And I don't doubt that you can think of any number of other instances as well. Okay. So specs are also necessary for packaging materials. It probably sounds obvious that packaging has got to ensure sealing integrity, and the materials have to be maintained to ensure this and to fulfill that sealing is fine throughout the shelf life. Okay, next, Scott. Now, for all of this, specifications aren't of much use unless there are accompanying test methods. So are your test methods capable of achieving what you're looking for? And do that when you're looking for comparative data in terms of your changing, will they be good enough to differentiate differences if indeed they exist? So in terms of reviewing, test methods is very much part of the whole review process. This is a slide I'd like, if we've got time for discussion, with people nearer to the coalface might like to expand on. How do you evaluate processes? You've got to look at, firstly, perhaps an advanced samples and evaluate the material in its own right. You manufacture X number of batches, Y batch size, and examine how the product is performed and the conformances or otherwise with the specifications, and commencing your stability trials. Yep. So what I've described up to now has been things within an internal controls, but there are also external factors that one needs to take on board in terms of changes. Your service provider, like your test laboratories, might change. I had an instance a number of years ago now where the registered test laboratories decided it wasn't going to test therapeutic goods anymore, and that created a major problem throughout the industry who were using this particular laboratory. If you're doing contract work, your contractors might want a particular change, or likewise, if inspectors come around, be they in-house inspectors or be they TGA or other regulatory inspectors, they might require changes as well. Okay. In terms of the external factors of materials, how reliable might a new source might be, especially if it's relocated. What are the short and long-term consequences? What happens if there's a change of management or ownership of the source, which might go beyond just changing the name of it? Does this have implications for your particular material? Okay. Most important, as we alluded to with the code requirements, the source really does need to change, or advise of changes rather, in any manufacturing process, because that change of manufacturing process might affect your product. If they've used a different mode of crystallization, for instance, is that going to affect your dissolution characteristic later down the line? So this requires a close working relationship with your source. Okay, next. So some final points. In my experience, purified natural products can be more variable than synthesized, especially if they're from different sources. So that's something to just be mindful about. And the long-term consequences, identifying any source perhaps needs to be considered. How stable is this company likely to be? How stable indeed these days, dare I say, is the environment that this particular company might be? Okay, so just a couple of, to sum up, existing specs don't necessarily cover the parameters that that might determine equivalence. That you've got to collaborate among a lot of people to ensure that the whole transition, if you do make a change, it goes smoothly. And as a personal view, once a product's developed and registered, a change of source of materials, I believe, is a last resort and requires very careful consideration. So sorry about the technical muck-up, but thanks very much, Scott, for rescuing me.
No problem, David. It happens to all of us, doesn't it, unfortunately?
Yes, indeed.
I'll stop the share there to bring us all on screen. Yeah, thanks everybody for your presentations as we've gone along. What I'll do is hopefully anyone out there, please do post some questions. We've got one here and I've got some ones that we got beforehand. So I'm just going to start going through those if that's okay with everybody. And Rebecca and Scott, have you seen that issue maybe from a slightly different angle, or from either being the supplier or the new supplier?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a number of incidents where we've had to contact regulators across the board, whether that be TGA or through to DAWE for more biologicals that certainly Merck has been involved in. And I think it's really around collaboration. So obviously for us, trying to get hold of the most information that we can from our own source plants, because to facilitate those discussions, the regulators need the information. So as much as we can give and provide all of that data behind it, I think it's really then being able to get that as quickly as possible to the regulators. For example, we had a recent, it's a biological one, so not a TGA topic, but on an issue on nutritive media because of occurrences of swine flu now in Germany again. And it was literally, we were talking with the regulators with our regulators in Germany, as well as the DAWE here in Australia, and talking through scenarios of how we could get that through. Now, it did take a few weeks. However, what situation at the start looked almost impossible, we were able to find some solutions to. And I think that's the collaboration that you talked about before as well, Felicity and Karen. It's really that you need to come together, you need the information, we need to put, I think it's always easier to have the right people at the table. And when you do that, I think you can find some solutions. And we've all lived this year with such agility that coming together, I think with the right information to make the right decisions, to make I guess the regulators' jobs easier at the end of the day. That's really what it's about.
Okay, thank you very much.
Further to that example, so we had everything come through, I think it was last week. So all of our orders on our supply sides were placed last week. So we're expecting to go fairly shortly now as well, which is very good.
Yeah, it was a good result.
Yeah, thank you for that. What we've got is another one come through, and it's probably the last question I have, and otherwise you can all ask each other a question if you like. We've got plenty of time if you're willing. Is it an option to specify a second source of supply of raw materials and consumables in quality contracts and service level agreements with suppliers? I don't really know who that's for, if that's for anyone. Everyone.
Well, from our point of view, I guess it's really up to the manufacturer to look at having that in place. So whether they initially set that up as part of their manufacturing process, that they have 2 sources of materials. And I guess then it relies on what the regulators are looking for in terms of approvals to ensure that there is that ability to swap sources. Particularly, as Scott alluded to, we looked in ourselves from our manufacturing plants around where we saw those supply lines being impacted from some sites around the world, whether we could flip and supply out of another site. And I think we did that on a couple of occasions that enabled us to continue to supply. But again, it was the same supplier and having the same steps in terms of approvals from our point of view.
Okay, excellent. Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, thank you for presenting. I appreciate your time and all of that, and appreciate everybody who's tuned in to listen to us. Thanks so much. See you later, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Everyone. Bye.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.